And good evening, everyone, and again, welcome to Teens and Cannabis Forum. I'm delighted that you're here tonight. I'm not going to say too much more, except that this issue is an interesting and multifaceted one, and we've seen that in the bit of media attention that we've had, and we know that many people have thoughts and ideas on the topic of cannabis, of young people, cannabis and young people, medical marijuana. We're not going to resolve it all tonight, but we believe strongly that it's important to have discussions and dialogue about it. And I think one way to frame it up is maybe thinking a little less about who is right and focusing a little bit more on gaining understanding. And I hope that that might be an outcome tonight as we go through this process.
So, in the most recent survey, in 2013, 17% of Vancouver 12 to 19-year-olds, that was slightly more boys than girls, had ever tried marijuana. This was down from a decade ago and from 5 years ago, from 24%, and it's lower than we see across the province at the current rate. And among young people who had ever tried marijuana, we saw that in Vancouver, more young people were waiting until they were a bit older before they did try it. So, for example, about half waited until they were at least 15 years old in 2013, compared to only a third in 2003. And we see that Vancouver youth are less likely than their peers across the province to wait until they're at least 15 before they try it. We saw fewer young people who were drinking and driving, but we saw more young people who'd used marijuana and driven a vehicle in the past month than had ever driven with alcohol in the system in their lifetime. So definitely more young people mixing marijuana and driving than we see with alcohol and driving. And we also saw 17% had ever been a passenger with a driver who was drinking and mixing that with marijuana. So for the first time on the survey, we asked young people their reasons for using marijuana and other substances, and they could choose kind of all the reasons that they thought applied to them. The most common reasons were that they wanted to have fun, that friends were doing it, or they wanted to experiment. Girls were more likely than boys to abuse because they were stressed or because they felt down or sad. And young people were also more likely to be used who were not getting mental health care that they thought they needed. And we also saw higher use among those who self-harmed or attempted suicide. We also see young people using them to manage symptoms. So, for example, young people with a chronic health condition or a disability were 3 times more likely to have used marijuana or other substances to manage physical pain than young people without a health condition. I think Jamie will be talking a bit more to the medical marijuana in a bit. But we also saw young people with ADHD 4 times more likely to use marijuana to help them to focus, and young people who had any sort of health condition or disability were more likely to be using to try and manage the symptoms of some other drug that they were taking. So we looked at what was present in the lives of those 16 to 18-year-olds who either were delaying use or were not using at all. And we saw that if young people had positive relationships with their family, for example, they felt their family understood them, they reported having fun with their family, then they were less likely to use or less likely to start early. Also, if young people were connected to their school, as I said earlier, if they had friends who kind of disapproved of their health risk behaviours. Also, not just if they did extracurricular activities, but if they felt engaged, if they felt valued in those activities, if they felt they were listened to, then they were less likely to be used at an early age. And also young people who have kind of high self-esteem, self-confidence, sense of being good at stuff, those young people were less likely to use at an early age.
When you're in your teenage years and in your early adult years, your brain is still developing. The work isn't done. The brain is still developing. And indeed, it's in high gear in development in the during the teenage years. And during this period, there are some key developmental stages occurring that really can be influenced by marijuana use, and in particular by frequent marijuana use. So one of the things that we do know is that in our brains we've got these receptors, they're called cannabinoid receptors, that really are in all of us. And when we smoke marijuana or ingest marijuana, it latches onto those receptors. And what happens when we get exposed to cannabis is that the brain really gets hijacked, and it results in really a change in our neural system, in our nervous systems, in our brains. And these are referred to as neurotoxic changes, brain changes. And I know that sounds very frightening, but I think it's important to understand that it is dose-related in part, but it is really important to recognize the vulnerability of young people and their exposure to marijuana. So cannabis, the other thing I will say, just to be clear, is that cannabis does have addictive properties. I think many of us, grew up believing that no, marijuana does not have addictive properties. But very much like alcohol, some people can drink alcohol and have no problem, and other people can't. And that's the same with cannabis, with marijuana. There is a percentage of people who will develop dependency problems in relation to marijuana. So heavy users, obviously, people who smoke frequently are obviously more likely to develop addiction problems. But here's the thing. Adults have about an 8 to 10 chance of becoming addicted, an 8 to 10% chance of becoming addicted when they smoke frequently. But teenagers have double that chance if they smoke in their teenage years. And so that's a concern to be thinking about as well. I want to begin by saying in our work in terms of understanding why young people smoke marijuana, I think it was pointed out so well in the survey, is that people use it for a variety of reasons. Some people just use it to actually have a pleasurable experience, to get high. But as we heard, that we also know that young people are also using marijuana to deal with serious health issues and problems. And these problems are not being dealt with in the system. And that's one of our responsibilities, our problem that we have, is that we've got to figure out why our health system is failing our young people, that they do not feel they can actually seek and receive the resources that they actually require. So I want to begin by saying that we see this phenomenon taking place. The other thing we know, and this is from research on educational interventions, is just say no does not work. It is not a credible message. Teens know that we can't use that message anymore. They turn around, they see their parents using for medical reasons. They turn around and they see friends in their lives seeming to have no consequences. So we can't just say no. We have got to talk about the context in which young people are using marijuana and help them understand the facts and engage and not be afraid of engaging in discussion. 10 years ago, we were afraid to talk about birth control with teenagers because we thought if we talked about birth control, they were going to actually start to go out and have sex all the time. That is not true either. We can talk about it and we can engage in conversation, and it's a very positive thing that we, and that's why I'm so pleased to hear the second half of the dialogue this evening.
The first pharmacopoeia anywhere in the world was also published in China under the Ming Dynasty, and it actually listed cannabis as one of the 50 most fundamental herbs of Chinese medicine and included it as an ingredient in over 1,000 different preparations for different illnesses and conditions. It actually was also in the British and US and Canadian pharmacopoeias as well, right up until about the 1930s. When, for reasons that appear to be mostly racist now, it was actually made a controlled substance. Other than a small blip during World War II when it was needed for hemp again, it's been an illicit substance in the Western world pretty much ever since. Medicinal use resurfaced again in the 90s. Until that point, the only recorded use between the 1930s and 1950s, 1960s was really slappers, beatniks, hippies, and it kind of stayed with those artists and counterculture communities for the most part until the 1990s. What happened was, particularly in San Francisco and Vancouver, there were very severe health crises related to the HIV epidemic. And what they had noticed was that cannabis had seemed to help. So the very first kind of modern iteration of the dispensary was in San Francisco in 1991. A patient opened it, and it was run as a collective by and for patients. It was open for about 4 years when the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States shut it down. The city of San Francisco actually complained to them. The sheriff wrote a very sharply worded letter, and it opened again 2 days later under completely different ownership. It was opened by a gay activist and lawyer named Dennis Perron, who actually was the first one to kind of get any media attention towards the dispensaries that were now starting to operate in California. The dispensary explosion in Vancouver has been an interesting thing to talk about. I learned something very important from Andy today that I find fascinating. In 2003, cannabis use in British Columbia for adolescents was 37% of teens had tried cannabis. The number of dispensaries in BC at that time were 5. In 2013, the number had dropped to 21%. The number of dispensaries in BC were 42. In Vancouver, the number was 33 dispensaries, and teen use had dropped all the way down to 17%. So we're not sure if we had anything to do with that, but we'd like to kind of think so. A lot of your children may actually be going to school with people that use cannabis medicinally, and if they're a minor that's using cannabis medicinally, the bar is set very, very high for them. There's a very good chance that they have a chronic condition that they may never recover from. There's a very good chance that all other medications has already been tried and proved ineffective before the point the doctor was willing to prescribe them cannabis. They have to deal with that, and then they have to deal with the stigma of people maybe asking them to share their medicine or treating them like stoners. So that can actually be really difficult for them. So I actually suggest the first time you bring up cannabis is the first time your child understands the concept of medicine. There's an excellent book called Mommy's Funny Medicine by Russell Barth and Christine Lowe. You can actually find it on YouTube as well, and it's written for children, and it's about medicinal use. Now, in terms of recreational use, really, at that point, it is like everything else. It's hard to track all of the facts and all of the studies. While cannabis probably does not improve your driving generally, if you're somebody that suffers epileptic seizures and you're taking a CBD oil to control those seizures, there's a very good chance that will actually improve your driving. There have been studies that have shown cannabis doesn't significantly impair your ability to drive a vehicle. Well, those studies are often done on people that have been using cannabis for a long time or have been driving for a long time. They're not specifically on youth that are not necessarily used to being impaired by cannabis and not necessarily that experienced driving. So those are all issues. And basically what we see is the same issues we see with anything else. Whether it's cannabis or felt markers or glue, if it can be used, it can be abused. And if you see a problem like that, really what you need is to intervene and be a parent. They don't want cannabis facts from you. It's great to have all these facts. It's very, very hard to sort them out. Even the coverage for this event, it was posted under headlines like "Dispensaries lull teens into thinking cannabis is okay." Nothing in the story actually said that. That's not actually what it was about. So there's a lot of confusion there. As Joy said, there's some really important things to consider. The first one is really not exaggerating the harms of drugs. You're actually doing yourself a great disservice if you do that. We've all seen the drug commercials. We've all seen all the comedy routines making fun of them.
So, Pam, please go ahead.
Jamie, what do you think it's ethical for somebody to be able to walk into the dispensary, say they've got back pain, be referred to a Skype conversation within the dispensary to somebody who's apparently a doctor, probably a naturopath, and then have their prescription ready at the counter for them to ring in just moments later?
We don't.
No, I didn't say do you do that. Do you think that's ethical?
No, we don't. CAMCD doesn't think that that's ethical. We've suggested a long time ago that there should be an arm's length.
Have you ever kicked out any members for doing that?
They haven't done it. There was one dispensary that did it for a while before the naturopathic college said that they didn't want to do that anymore, and then they stopped instantly. But of the association members, none of them do that. That's actually, again, one of the criticisms we have of the Health Canada system, where they've got clinics set up where you walk in and you Skype and you get your legal prescription from a mail-out place.
And what about these places on the drive that have people out front with clipboards beckoning people in? That seems to me that that's about money. That's not about caring about medical welfare of people. That's about money, just like any other pharmacy or pharmaceutical industry. They've got a product, they want to sell it. What do you say to that?
There's 80 dispensaries in town. So, I mean, what I can tell you is all of the oldest ones have actually been losing a lot of money, not only to the dispensaries, but fighting court battles for patient rights to grow, for example, that don't actually affect us at all, for patients' rights to access edibles under the legal system, which again, doesn't actually affect us at all. So we've been spending a lot of money on that. Out of the 80 dispensaries in Vancouver, I can't say they're all doing that. There's no way they're all doing that. When we hear of somebody trying to open a dispensary in Squamish and they start getting a lot of hassles and they're not able to do that, that's a concern for us because we don't need another 10 dispensaries here. We need a dispensary in Squamish. And
The Pain Management Society on Commercial Drive said to me that cannabis is really good for concussions. If you go to the GF Strong, the guy said that to me, I have him on tape.
I don't
If you go to the GF Strong, they say whatever you do not use alcohol or pot. So a lot of these places, they're flogging it. And even though it may have really great roots and a fabulous history and good reasons, I think that the industry, we have to recognize that your industry is about selling a product, is about money and about making money overall. What do you say to that? Just like any other pharmaceutical
our
industry.
For that is, for example, the BC Compassion Club has 50 people that are working for about $14 an hour, and that we have no managers. We run that collectively. Any profits that the society makes actually goes into the wellness center.
Okay,
and
we're gonna cut it there. You guys can carry that one on after, if you don't mind, Jamie, because I'd like to just...
Sure. I do want to say 2 lab dispensaries out of 80 doesn't mean most. So, I mean, I do agree it's a problem. It's why we've been asking for regulations all along. And that's why we're against the for-profit model of the NPR as well. We'd like to see nonprofits specifically be regulated to be profit dispensaries.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The question is, do other drugs affect the brain, in deleterious ways? And absolutely they do. I mean, I want to be clear here. This is the other thing that happens even in terms of the way in which we test drugs in this country, in terms of any drug. We test them on adults, and we then put them onto the market, and then actually, to tell you the truth, we experiment by giving them to our children when they actually have a medical condition we don't know how to treat. So it's a problem across in terms of a number of substances. And I think there are a number of issues, and we've heard about particular types of drugs, some of the antidepressant medications in particular, and their effects on the developing brain. Some great concerns about that. So I'm not saying naively that it's only a cannabis problem, not at all. I think we have to be, again, be balancing and thinking about the implications. And again, if a child needs treatment, needs support, we also have to balance, as we do with any condition, risks and benefits.
I have a 10th grade boy and an 8th grade boy, both at different journeys as it relates to this topic. The 8th grader had recently gone through the educational program, and talking to him about it and saying, what did you think? What came back was, well, I'm curious to try it. Now, I agree with the messaging before around just don't say no doesn't make sense. I don't think but I don't agree with the analogy around, say, the sex ed conversation, because in that scenario, maybe the youth end up having sex, but they're having protected sex, they've been educated, and it's not the same danger. And the addictive nature of the cannabis here, if you had 20%, we said, hey, come to this lecture tonight, but a fifth of you, you're going to have your lives messed up. I don't think we'd have such a great turnout. So the question is, what do you say then to the child who's gotten educated and says, I'm curious, I want to try it now?
I think that's a great question, and I would take a page out of the talk that we just heard about and say, well, why are you curious? What is it about it? What did you hear? Let's talk about it. That's what I would do, because I think that, there's not, again, and this was the message I heard tonight, there's never anything wrong about having a conversation. And so I actually wouldn't be panicked by that kind of statement. I think that it also can be provocative on the part of a young person, that they're demonstrating they've got knowledge on a subject, that they want to engage in a discussion. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it really comes down to how the education is done. What is it comprised of? And how is it delivered? And if it is a how-to, or, here's the different drugs and